Monica Smith is professor in the Department of Anthropology and a professor in the Institute of the Environment and Sustainability at the University of California, Los Angeles. She holds the Navin and Pratima Doshi Chair in Indian Studies and is the director of the South Asian Archaeology Lab at the Cuisine Institute of Archaeology. Dr. Smith received her BA in Classical Civilizations, Ancient Roman Greece, at the University of California, Santa Barbara, her MA in Archaeology from UCLA, and her PhD in Anthropology from the University of Michigan. Her field experience includes participation on projects in England, India, Italy, Egypt, Madagascar, Bangladesh, Tunisia, and with the National Park Service in the American Southwest. With her colleague R.K. Mohanty, she has co-directed a long-running archaeological research project in Eastern India at the sites of Sisapalgar, I know I'm gonna not pronounce that correctly, Talapada and Astapur and their environments. And this is supported by funding from the US National Science Foundation, the National Geographic Society, the Wenner-Gren Foundation for Anthropological Research, and the American Institute of Indian Studies. Her books include Cities, the first 6,000 years, a prehistory of ordinary people, and with R.K. Mohanty, Excavations at Sispulgar. She's in her third term as an academic trustee on the AIA's governing board. And today her talk is on Indian cuisine, past and present. And I hope you've all brought your appetite for a lunchtime discussion of the ingredients, history, and archaeology of the subcontinent's wonderful palette of foods. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Monica Smith.
Thank you very much, and it's wonderful to be here as part of the Archaeology Abridged series for the Archaeological Institute of America. What I'd like to do today is to think about the wonderful world of Indian cuisine, but I also want to say a few words about the ways that archaeologists study food all over the planet, no matter where it is that they're working. Archaeologists are always hungry. So we are interested in contemporary cuisine, and we are interested in the long history of the human environmental interactions that make that cuisine possible. So let's think for a little while about how archaeologists study ancient food. And if you are not familiar with the archaeology of food, you might initially be thinking that, well, if food is eaten, then how can there be anything left to study? In terms of understanding what happens with food in the ancient world and in our long human past, archaeologists take a very global view, because everywhere that people have migrated on the planet for the last million years or so, we have, of course, always been eating. And there are many ways that archaeologists consider the environment, the topography, the geology, the geography, and the capacity of different global regions to provide the kinds of food that people are interested in eating. Now, one of the things that helps us out as a species is that we are, of course, omnivores. There are many things that people could eat that we don't culturally from one group to another. And so when people come into a landscape, they are selectively looking at the kinds of plants and animals and other resources that can be part of their culinary repertoire. So I'm showing you here a map of global annual rainfall, because the weather, the climate, the topography, the soil is the basis on which plants and animals survive that can then turn into the kinds of cuisine that we make of our environments. So the human environmental dynamic is really critical in forming that basis of food and food activities. So how do we study that environment? Not only looking at things like rainfall patterns, but really drilling down literally to capture those little microscopic traces of environmental potential. So one of the things that archaeologists do is they can take sediment cores to look at the kinds of things that are in the environment, such as pollen that's raining down, or sediments that are getting washed in from agricultural fields into still lakes and other water bodies that then allow us to evaluate all of the different kinds of things that are happening in that landscapes. So the types of grasses, the types of trees, and the types of human land use are all recorded in the sediments that flow down to the bottoms of lakes. And there are many things in that sediment that we can put under a microscope to be able to look at the sum total of the environment, in addition to what it is that humans are planting and growing. So, for example, pollen tells us about the environment. We might think of pollen as mostly a sneezy nuisance, but pollen is something that, of course, allows plants to propagate and thrive. And we can look at these very different looking pollens to understand not only what humans are growing, but what is growing naturally in the environment. And it doesn't matter how sophisticated agriculture becomes, people are still always using wild foods as well. There's another kind of invisible archaeology that helps us to understand what it is that people are doing with their environments. And that is something called phytoliths, which are the microscopic silica residues of plant parts that have otherwise decomposed. But because it's silica, it preserves the cell wall and other parts of plants that let us look at things that would otherwise be completely invisible to archaeologists. And this is helpful because we can get the phytoliths not only of cultivated plants like sorghum or rice, as you see here, and they're really different looking. So under a microscope, you can absolutely tell what kind of plant these phytoliths came from. Not only from cultivated plants, but also from weeds. And some of the most interesting work everywhere in the world on archaeology of plants is about the kinds of weeds that come along for the ride whenever it is that people start cultivating plants for their domestic use. There are other kinds of things that we can see microscopically that tell us about the watery environment of a particular landscape. And plants that are being grown sometimes require flowing water, sometimes benefit from still water. And there are microalgae that we can see under a microscope that also respond to these different kinds of conditions. So in these microscopic evaluations, we can look at exactly what kinds of landscapes ancient people were having in their vicinity, but also the kinds of landscapes that people were deliberately making. People are making ponds and dams and reservoirs to be able to use water during the dry season and extend their cropping regime in ways that we can find out through these microscopic traces. Sometimes we're lucky enough to get actual preserved plant parts. And in many tropical regions, this only happens under exceptional conditions, such as carbonization in a fire that then preserves the material for us to be able to look at. But in other parts of the world, we get even better luck. And that, for example, gives us the opportunity to look at things like pepper transport, which in this case is coming from India and found at the Roman site of Berenica in Egypt, all the way across the Indian Ocean. Not just one or two peppercorns that made that journey, but here you see an ancient pot that still had about 15 pounds of pepper in it. So if that's the leftovers of the Roman Indian trade regime, can you imagine how many pots and sacks of pepper were coming from the Indian subcontinent in the Roman period, a couple of thousand years ago, going all the way to Rome itself, from Egypt, across the eastern desert, up the Nile, across the Mediterranean, and right into the cooking pot of a fancy Roman feast maker using, for example, Apicius's cookbook to really spice things up. Of course, in the process of archaeological investigations, we look at all of the aspects of food and preparation that we can get from an ancient site. We're looking at the cooking pots, we're looking at the water pots, we're looking at the environment, we're looking at the preparation utensils, we're looking at the serving vessels and the eating utensils. All of those things give us an opportunity to think about cuisine from the entire realm of preparation to consumption and then subsequent discard. We can sometimes get in archaeological sites the opportunity to look at what kinds of local environments are making an impact not only on cuisine, but also on ideology and thought processes and symbolism. So here at our archaeological investigations at the ancient city of Shishpalgar, you see here in the middle an entire deer antler, which of course you're not expecting wild deer in a city, but people are bringing those antler parts in. And even at another side of Talapada, an elephant tooth. So little things like that, even one at a time, remind us that even in very urbanized ancient environments, people are engaging with a dynamic landscape of plants and animals all the time. When we do archaeological investigations, we often try to recover as many of the little things as possible, including not only the plant remains, but also the animal bones that are part of the archaeological site. And down there at the bottom of the image, you'll see a couple of strange little disc-like things. And those are fish bones. So that when we think about the archaeology of plants and animals, let's not forget fish, because fish are part of the repertoire of global cuisine, and they're a great source of protein and something that can be acquired by people at all different scales, from a kid with a fishing pole to a trawler and a net in the sea. When we recover our archaeological remains, we often find them in composition with things like pottery, as you see here. We've got a lot of marine shells, so don't forget that ocean trade of food is also very likely and very possible, including things like preserved fish. Fish doesn't travel well without refrigeration, as you can imagine, but people from a very early time used to salt fish to be able to trade it across long distances. When we look at the bones themselves, we're able to evaluate the composition of the environments that those bones came from. So we have isotopic studies that we can do for carbon or nitrogen or strontium to be able to tell the diets of plants and animals and where in the environments their foods are coming from. And sometimes these are coming from a very long distance. So you might find a person with a strontium isotope signature very far inland, but you know that they must have been consuming some fish. And then there are some really strange and wonderful things that archaeologists do in order to be able to study ancient food and cuisine. So you know that when you go to the dentist, one of the things that the dentist does is clean your teeth. And there's a buildup of all kinds of things that stick to your teeth. And over time, if you didn't have your teeth cleaned, that tartar would build up and would be there forever. Well, that's one way of finding out about ancient diet. But in many parts of the world, animal teeth are more prevalent in an archaeological site than human teeth. So some very interesting studies have been done on the dental calculus. That is the fancy word for tooth gunk, because cows don't brush their teeth. What you have is the accumulation of tooth gunk from cows and other animals that you can study to see those microscopic particles of what they've been eating. Of course, archaeologists are living in the context of the areas where they do research. So another way that we also understand and learn about ancient practices of cropping is to watch modern practices that might be similar in some way. So in many parts of the Indian subcontinent, so countries like Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Nepal, we have places where people are still doing some intensive low-tech farming that really gives us an idea of how much work went into the very beginnings of food production, because living in a village and being part of that life while we're there doing our archaeological research, we recognize how much work goes into planting, plowing, preparing, harvesting, and storing the kinds of foods that people use as the basis for their cuisine. So what we have is that whole range of activities from the beginnings of the field preparation right through to the joyous moments of harvest, which, like every place in the world, is a time of relief and celebration, that people have brought a harvest in and they will be able to have things for the rest of the year. And in our activities, we do, of course, a lot of cooking. So we can see here our wonderful team of people, including our cook Ali, our driver Satya, serving here at the site of Talapada, where we've been working an area of intensive bringing together of people for a celebration and cooking up some wonderful meals out of the kinds of things that come from the market every day, as you see here on the right-hand side of the slide. So what is the legacy of this long archaeological history of cuisine? And what is the legacy of Indian cuisine in particular? What I'd like to do now is to walk you through a typical Indian meal of the kind that you might be able to get at a restaurant, maybe even a restaurant this evening, if this inspires you to think about some Indian food, whether going to a restaurant or some wonderful takeout. So one thing that you can do if you are not very familiar with Indian cooking is to order something called a thali. And a thali is a plate of many, many different kinds of things. It's a wonderful way to experiment with all of the different kinds of foods that come from the Indian subcontinent. And so let's take a look at the various things that you'll find on your thali when you order it. And let's start with the thing that's right there in the middle, the rice. There is a long history of rice cultivation in the Indian subcontinent, and it is one of the main staples of Indian cuisine all over the Indian subcontinent. And it has that centrality in the plate for a reason. There is a long history of rice cultivation in the Indian subcontinent that has to do with that human environmental nexus involving rainfall. So I showed you this picture of rainfall before, and now let's zoom into that part of the world that has an exceptionally high rainfall, and that is the Indian subcontinent, Southeast Asia, and China, of course, all places that have rice as an essential component of their cuisine. Rice is a grain that definitely responds to the annual cycle of the hot summer weather and the monsoon. There is some dry rice, but the majority of intensified rice agriculture in the Indian subcontinent, as elsewhere, is wet rice agriculture. And this involves a series of activities before the rainfall to prepare the field and make it flat, during the rainfall to do the planting, and then after the rainfall to do the harvest. So there's a very close tie-in between natural cycles of rainfall and the cultivation of rice. And that idea of the monsoon is something that is celebrated precisely because it kicks off this agricultural cycle. And there are so many poems and songs and stories and Bollywood movies that focus on this idea of the monsoon as this moment where the summer heat is finally broken and the clouds are rolling like elephants in the thunder. And then you have this rainfall that brings the possibility of new life through the growing of rice. That rice is something that takes up a great deal of time, energy, thought, love, and poetry in the Indian subcontinent, in these local villages, right up to the most densely occupied cities. And it all comes down to this grain that people harvest and that they dry, as you see here on the lower left-hand side, they dry it in the pathways of the village. And the Indian tradition of music, song, and poetry is full of the celebration of rice as the most wonderful thing that one can eat, and that rice is the basis for all kinds of celebratory moments. The rice manufacturing and production has changed the landscape of the Indian subcontinent completely. And there's been some very nice work by Julia Shaw and colleagues at the Buddhist site of Sanchi in India from about 2000 years ago that talks about how this landscape has been modified for the production of rice agriculture, so that you have rice, humans, environments, religious traditions, which we also see in the temple economies of the medieval Indian period. That is something that is continually socially, ritually, and politically reinforcing about the rice that goes on the plate. But of course, there are many other things to eat. And one of them is wheat. Wheat was first domesticated in the area of the ancient Near East, and like many foods that have transported the globe, also came into the Indian subcontinent at a very early time period. And in the northern part of India, there tends to be a little bit more focus on wheat eating. And in the southern portion of India, there tends to be a little bit more focus on rice eating. But when you go to an Indian restaurant today and you ask for a thali, you'll be getting a little bit of both. So you'll be getting some kind of a flat wheat bread that will then be part of the meal as well. Then you have other types of things from which you can make a bread or cracker-like substance. And in the Indian subcontinent, there are so many different kinds of these snacks, crackers, papards that are made of a variety of lentil flours and chickpea flours that then are rolled or fried or baked that become part of the meal as well. Then you have many different types of lentils, chickpeas, and other pulses that are protein rich and that form an essential component of the Indian diet. So in a village context, a lunch might be a big plate of rice right there in the middle, and then also some lentils made into a kind of lentil puree called dal. So rice and dal is a lovely kind of lunch to walk in from a long morning of excavation and be able to enjoy with our team. Of course, there's a lot of spicing and flavoring in the lentils, and this is where that cow tooth gunk comes in handy as an analytical perspective, because archaeologists have been able to analyze what it is that cows were eating, sort of nosing around in the garbage at the end of the day, and finding that there are traces of things like ginger in the cow's dental calculus that shows that people were definitely cooking and eating in some of this same kind of style, even all the way back to the Indus period, 4,000 to 5,000 years ago. So there are many aspects of Indian cuisine that have been around for a very long time. And of course, those cows are producing some wonderful dairy products. And there are many ways that dairy products are utilized, from clarified butter or ghee to the creation of a kind of a soft cheese called paneer, which is then put into a sauce, or things like a raita and yogurt that are also part of a typical Indian meal. So when you order your thali, most of the things on the plate will be warm, but there'll be some things that are cold, like the kind of sour-ish dairy products that you see here. And then, of course, you have peas, like lentils, pulses, and other things like chickpeas or garbanzo beans. Peas are very much part of the repertoire of Indian cooking and have been for hundreds of years. And then you have the little things that come on the side of your thali. So you have little bits of cut up vegetables, maybe a piece of an onion or something. And then kind of hiding under a piece of onion, you might see a little dollop of something that is very almost kind of bitter, astringent, rich, deep, dark, earthy, beautiful taste. And that is mango pickle. So not sweet mango, but green mango, like sour mango. And this is where a household really distinguishes itself. When you go to somebody's house, you know that grandmother or auntie has been making some pickle, and it's preserved in a jar over the course of months to keep it and make it really flavorful, and a little bit of it comes onto your plate. So absolutely try this. It is the pride of every household to have some pickle that goes with your meal. And finally, of course, there is a little dessert. And this is sugar and sugarcane, which came to India probably about 5,000 to 6,000 years ago. And like ginger, pulses, rice, and wheat have been part of the repertoire of Indian cuisine for many, many hundreds of years. And in this case, what you might have on your thali is actually a wonderful marriage of sugar and then also a dairy product, because this is a gulab jamun, one of my personal favorites, that is a sweet ball of prepared milk product that's then fried and then put into a syrup, which is really lovely. So that is your thali that you can walk through now and have a taste of some of these various things. But you might say, what about the archaeology of these things? What about things like potatoes or tomatoes? Or if you're familiar with the custom of Indians taking tea, what about tea? Well, like many other cuisines, today's Indian cuisine is globalized. Of course, in ancient times, there were not potatoes because those were domesticated and came from Peru and the Andes. There were not tomatoes because that is another old world food. And there was not tea because that came from China, basically during the British period. So what is it about these cuisines that have now become part of the repertoire? It's hard to imagine Indian food now without potatoes or without tomatoes for your paneer makhni or something like that. And we can see how these things have been introduced into the Indian repertoire. It's actually a wonderful study by a UCLA graduate student, Sucharita Kanjilal, who has talked about tomatoes as one of the introductions of a relatively recent period that has now become an integral part of Indian cuisine. And as for things like tea that finish out the meal, this is something that is also a relatively recent addition that comes with a global perspective. But the traditions of Indian cooking from before this globalized moment that started about 500 years ago is echoed in the traditions of ritual cuisine that deny the introduction of things like potatoes and tomatoes into the meal. So very traditional temple cooking, like what you see here from the Puri temple in Odisha state, very close to where we've been working with our team. There is a culinary tradition of providing to pilgrims cooked dishes, a variety, dozens of different cooked dishes, but they only use the kinds of vegetables and other inputs that would have been available prior to that moment of global contact. So it's a nice reminder that just like everywhere in the world, Indian cuisine has been modified, changed, and developed over time in ways that have achieved a traditional basis, but have also introduced at selective moments and in response to different aspects of consumption, new ways of thinking and new ways of cooking that are also very exciting in their experience. What I'd like to do now is to thank all of the people with whom I have been so fortunate to share meals over the many years of working in the Indian subcontinent and sharing meals together, whether in small kitchens or in large groupings like this. And of course, I also want to thank the many entities and groups who have been supporting our research in the Indian subcontinent and elsewhere. And as a closing moment, I would also like to highlight that the work that I've been talking about here is something that represents the research of many, many dozens of people all over the Indian subcontinent and in the United States and Europe and elsewhere. So I wanted to recognize and illustrate that there are many people working on the wonderful world of South Asian cuisine, including all of these wonderful folks here, and of course, many, many others. Thank you very much for allowing me to share your lunchtime, and I wish you bon appetit. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Monica. I'm grateful that I had my lunch before you did your talk because the tally looked amazing. We're going to have Ben Thomas, who is our Director of Programs, field the question and answer session of this. And I see that there's been a number of interesting different questions that have been brought in. So I'm going to turn it over to Ben and Monica.
Perfect. Thank you, Rebecca. Yes, a bunch of questions, Monica. So let's start with this from my colleague, Kevin, actually. Can you discuss the adoption of hot peppers that are, of course, native to the New World? How does it, it's hard to think of modern curries without those peppers.
Indeed, and I'm glad you brought this up in the Q&A because it is so starkly astonishing that when you think about it, that I decided not to put it in the talk because I knew it would come up. And it is something that is very difficult to believe, right? Because we associate the cuisines of China, like Szechuan cooking and Thai cooking and Indian cooking. We associate that so strongly with hot chili peppers that it is a real stopper, to think about, wait, this was not part of the repertoire. But there were many ways in which Indian cooking was, spicy prior to the introduction of the chili peppers from the New World. So you have ginger, which is very hot. You have pepper, which is also very hot. So that what we think of as being kind of a surprising introduction is something that actually was already scaffolded into the cuisines of that region. When you think about how people respond to or desire spicy food, even in Europe, we don't think of European cooking as being spicy, but think about mustard. Think about German mustard is very spicy. Or in the Roman period, you've got things like pepper that are going into. There's something about spice that is really attractive to people. It's something that is viewed as, once you go down that path of spiciness, whether as an individual or as a whole culture, you start to crave it and appreciate it in ways that make you onboard new things whenever they show up.
So actually, jumping off of that question, there seem to be several questions about spices in general. So you just mentioned ginger, but generally a little bit on just sort of the history of these spices. Are they wild herbs that people are gathering? What other than ginger and cinnamon and cloves, but a little bit about the introduction of spices into the cuisine and what we know about that.
Right. So cloves are actually from Southeast Asia. They're from the Moluccas. And while we think of them again as being, very much incorporated into Indian cuisine, those also would have come from someplace else. What we see in terms of the spicing is that that's a little bit of an understudied realm. So this would make a great dissertation project for somebody to look at, wild inputs, including spices and many other kinds of wild things. Here you also get a transition from things like food to medicine that are very much part of the wild repertoire. And so, when people are talking about gathering things, they're often gathering things that are astringents or purgatives or things that you can make as a poultice or something that will help you to help you heal. So turmeric, for example. I remember walking into the kitchen one day, and one of the folks who was working with us was in the kitchen. He was getting some turmeric powder. Turmeric is from that root that is a very, very bright yellow powder that's a little bit astringent. It makes a great stain. So, if you have a stain of turmeric, you're going to have some trouble getting it out. But he had taken a little pinch of that turmeric and was putting it on a cut that he had on his hand, because it was healing. It had healing properties. And you also see people sometimes applying turmeric as a facial. So you see young girls in the village, and they'll have this very sort of yellow face one morning, because they're doing a turmeric facial. So is that food? Is that medicine? Is that something else? That's something that we also see when we look for it in the archaeological record. But this idea of spices and flavorings is something that there's still a whole world of research to do.
A question about the pre-colonial Indian diet. The question being, how balanced and healthy was it?
Yes, so Indian cuisine is often viewed, as a very healthy kind of diet. I think of all of the global diets that are viewed as being ultra healthy, Mediterranean diet is one, and Indian diet is another. So the idea of rice as a starch, and then pulses as a protein, dairy for vitamins, and also protein and calories. Not too much sugar. There's not too much. There's not really a baking culture in traditional Indian households today in the village, right? And people don't have ovens. They cook everything out in a pan or in a pot. So there's not so much of things like cakes and pastries and pies and cookies. People don't traditionally have at home the facilities to make those kinds of things. So, an ancient Indian diet would have been, predominantly the starch, the rice or the wheat, and then something like the lentils, and then some kind of vegetable, including leafy vegetables. There's a whole category of leafy vegetables that you get in. I see you, I see you nodding, right? So there's a vegetable that we can get from the local market by the side of the road for about 2 weeks in January, which happens to be our field season. And we anticipate that vegetable with great delight because it's really delicious, but it's very limited. So there's also a lot of leafy vegetables that would have been part of the ancient Indian cuisine. So you have your rice or wheat, you have your vegetables or pulses, you have your leafy vegetable, and then you have some dairy, and it's a lovely balanced diet. And I think it's something that would be considered very healthy. What makes it a little bit less healthy now is that people might be using lots and lots of ghee, which is clarified butter, or they might be frying more things now, which of course people all over the world love fried things. We can't help it. And that would be a little bit less healthy. Yeah.
Right. So I'm actually going to ask you this one first. There's some other questions that came up, but let me ask you this. So there was a question that said, in your excavations, have you found surprising discoveries, foods, drinks, spices in some periods that are not eaten or found anymore?
Okay. So I can tell you that the predominant thing that we're finding in terms of animal remains is fish. And fish is, in archaeological context, again, a little bit of an understudied thing, because fish bones often don't survive very well. You have to look for them, through water sieving, or through, very careful flotation and things like that. You're often not going to see anything but the very biggest fish bones in the dirt. So one of the things we're seeing is a lot of fish that's being utilized. And then a lot of rice also that's coming out of it. And so the local workers are like, yes, fish and rice. We've been eating that for thousands of years. But in terms of things that are, surprisingly different, no, what we see is a great continuity of culture. And again, I think that speaks to the wisdom and stability and nutritional value of these crops, that you have this diet of rice and fish and pulses that has continued for such an incredibly long time.
Now, so again, when you're looking at this, both archaeologically and even just sort of within sort of contemporary society, the question is, what are the distinctions between kind of a regular person or a common person diet and the elites? What are the big differences?
So, even today, there are places, places that are quite off the beaten track. You think of South Asia as being a very crowded place, but there are many parts of India, Bangladesh, Nepal, Sri Lanka, Pakistan that are really quite remote, and people don't have access to, imported foods or, special purpose foods or things like that. It's a pretty basic diet. And so a basic diet would be things like rice, and then another kind of vegetable, which is eggplant. So eggplant is something that can be grown almost anywhere, and it's generally thought of as poor people's food. In fact, if you go into a restaurant in India, you will almost never be able to get eggplant on the menu, because it would be like going to a restaurant here and ordering a peanut butter sandwich, right? That's something you eat at home. Eggplant is something you eat at home. So that, I think, would be kind of a marker of somebody who's of relatively restricted means, basic wheat bread, basic rice, some pulses, and then some eggplant. Whereas with a wealthier person's diet, depending on whether they're vegetarian or non-vegetarian, there might be different kinds of meat involved, or different kinds of fish. Some fish in the market now are much more expensive than other kinds of fish. They're much more difficult to get. Things like eggs, but then also like the types of vegetables, like from how far they come, or things like mangoes. Mangoes out of season are considered like the ultra elite kind of thing to be able to eat. And people race, at the beginning of mango season, they race to get like the first mangoes. And if you've got mangoes on your table before your neighbors do, that's a sign that you've got the resources to do that.
It's interesting. I mean, and there's some questions about sort of meat and the role of meat in Indian cuisine.
Mhm.
In ancient times, when does it change to be sort of primarily vegetarian? And what is the kind of the idea of meat in Indian cuisine?
So the subject of meat has been covered by many, many books that discuss the varying diets, what you can see archaeologically, where there is definitely more of a meat-eating cuisine up until about 2,000 years or so ago, and that you've got a long tradition of vegetarianism in the Indian subcontinent. And in fact, I think it is the most widespread of vegetarian cuisines anywhere in the world, and that has certainly inspired people all over the world, through political leaders like Gandhi, who espoused a vegetarian diet, to all kinds of other practitioners. And there's a lot of discussion about the politics of meat eating, but then also when you think of very celebratory cuisines in India, particularly in northern India, like Mughlai cooking is all about lamb, or biryanis and chicken Manchurian and chicken tikka, which is practically the national dish of England. So there is definitely a component of meat eating in Indian cuisine that has been it was very early in the archaeological record, and then now, as more people can afford meat, it has kind of come back into prominence. But there's also a big social conversation around meat and meat eating.
So that leads into a question where it was about sort of the Mughal influence in India. What does that change? Well, how does that change the cuisine?
So, the Indian subcontinent has been connected to the Silk Road for at least 2.5, 3,000 years. And so all of these activities of herding and, Central Asian connectivity between India and the northern parts of India is something that had been around for a long time. So in the Indus period, 2500 BC, that's 4,500 years ago, we can see that there's meat eating, people are eating goat and sheep and things like that. So there's always that kind of substrate of meat eating that is part of subcontinental cuisine. And then what gets brought in from the Iranian plateau and from other parts of Central Asia is the cuisines of things like pulaus and biryanis and things like nuts. So when you order a pulau is a rice dish that has other kinds of things in it, so usually fruits and nuts. And even that has a kind of political tinge to it, because there is a very lovely kind of pulao that you can get in an Indian restaurant now that has things like cashews and dried fruits, dried cherries and raisins. And it used to be called Kashmiri pulao, in reflection of Kashmir, where these kinds of fruits and nuts grow. And then sometimes it's also called Kabuli pulao for Kabul.
Right.
So the history of Indian food is kind of brought back in these names that sort of pause and make you think about the connectivity of the Indian subcontinent with Central Asia and with Western Asia over these long spans of time. And then, of course, India is sending things, as early as the Roman period. There's all these, think about those sacks of pepper moving back and forth. So cuisine is a mode of cultural contact.
Here's a question that amuses me every time I hear. What is a curry, Monica?
Yes. Okay. So a curry is an anglicization of basically the idea of putting together lots of spices in a gravy. So that's all it is. And it's very idiosyncratic. Every household is going to have a different taste, a different style. And, if you read an Indian cookbook, they'll be very particular about all the spices and when they go in and this, that, and this, that, and this. That. I've found, in my own cooking that one doesn't have to be quite so strict about it. Because I've watched people cook and they're just putting this, that, this, that, this, that. And so a curry is just a spiced gravy, and it doesn't have to be hot spice either, right? So you can have like a cashew nut gravy that is just lovely, or a coconut gravy that is not spicy. So you can go into a South Asian restaurant and ask for something and have it be not spicy. And there's lots of things that go into that category.
It's funny because that was one of the things about trying to learn to cook from my mother. There was no measurement. Everything was a little bit of this, a little bit of that. And, it produced this curry at the end of it all.
Mm-hmm.
What was drunk in India before tea? You said tea sort of comes in with the British. What are people drinking before they have tea?
Yes, I'm glad you asked about tea, because I do find it very interesting that tea didn't come in earlier, because there was contact between China and India for such a long time. And we know that because there were Buddhist pilgrims from China coming to India, because India was the birthplace of Buddhism. Right there on the India-Nepal border was the location of the historical Buddha's birthplace. And so people have been coming on pilgrimage to India for at least 2,000 years, searching out the footsteps of the Buddha. And there were these Chinese pilgrims who were coming to South Asia. And so why they did not bring tea with them at that point, and why tea was not adopted, I keep having to look this up, because I also find I have a certain sense of disbelief about tea being so late. Because tea in China has this same exalted position that kind of rice does, that, tea is the poet's friend, as they say in China. So something that is a kind of esoteric beverage that produces a kind of caffeinated, feeling, is something that should have traveled. So I think we need more archaeological studies of tea. But before tea, certainly there would have been water. There would have been, the water that's used from cooking rice. There would have been probably concoctions with ginger. There is an ancient textual tradition that calls talks about a beverage called soma. We're not exactly sure what that is. It dates to the Vedic period. It's part of the Vedic ritual tradition. So that's from at least about 3,000 years ago or so. And they talk about preparing the soma, preparing this beverage. We're not quite sure what it is. It probably is from one of the semi-hallucinogenic plants. So there were beverages that were prepared in a way to be celebratory. There's also toddy, which is something that's made of coconuts, which is highly alcoholic. There's also a tradition of toddy that probably would have gone back quite a ways. Every culture, as soon as they start doing agriculture, has a way of fermenting beverages.
Yes. Several questions about when chicken becomes popular in India, and dishes like butter chicken, which, where do these things come from? Because they're not sort of necessarily traditional.
Right. So there is a wonderful book by my colleague Andrew Lawler called How the Chicken Crossed the World. And it's all about how the chicken shows up. And it's almost as soon as the chicken appears anyplace, it becomes amazingly popular, because it is something that, compared to, if you are, apologies to vegetarians here, but if you are a meat eater, something like a sheep, a goat, or, similar sized animal requires a large number of eaters in a pre-refrigeration world, whereas a chicken is like a family-sized package. I think that's why chicken is still much more popular. Like in the United States today, chicken is the go-to meat for many people because of that sizing issue, I think. Whereas turkey is once a year, right? But chicken, anytime. So there's not that much chicken. I don't think there's any chicken in the Indus period. I think the first chicken shows up in maybe around 2,000 years ago or so, but not very widespread, and probably not compared to other birds as well. We get other birds in the repertoire, wild birds that people are, and to this day, people are still eating wild birds. So chicken is increasingly popular, probably, in the last 20 to 30 years in India, for the same reason that it's increasingly popular in our own context here in the US, is that it's, it reproduces quickly, it has both eggs and meat, it's a family-sized package, and it subsists. A chicken can live on scraps, basically. So it's a good kind of village animal, as well as an animal that's suitable for industrial production.
Question about garam masala.
Yes.
Where did that come in? And interestingly, a question whether it's connected to the Roman garum or garum.
Okay, so garam is heat, and garam masala is just spices, right? So it's like chicken tikka masala just means chicken tikka with spices, and masala is very idiosyncratic by household, just as the curry from which masala is made. So garam masala is a concoction of many different spices that go together. And if you look, like if you buy a package of garam masala, there's a wonderful thing about shopping at an Indian store or South Asian store, is that, when you go to a Ralph's or, some other kind of market, Vaughn's, whatever, Piggly Wiggly, whatever you've got, you buy spices in a little packet like this. And when you go to an Indian store, you buy spices in a packet like this, because of the quantities that are generally utilized, even in a, ordinary kind of household. So be prepared to, put stuff in a jar when you get it home.
No connection to Roman garum.
No connection to Roman garum, and it's not even actually spelled the same, because in India the garam masala is an AM, and the garam, which is a fish sauce utilized in the Roman world, is a UM. So yeah, no connection there.
How about honey? Is that a big thing in India? Are they using it in ancient times?
Oh, interesting question about honey. So nowadays, the way that you buy honey is generally in a pharmacy, and it's in very small bottles in India. You generally don't get honey in like even a grocery store. It's something that's viewed as medicinal. Um, what would be the archaeological signature of honey? Um, that's a really great question. I'm not entirely sure how you would trace that down. There would probably be, you could do some pollen analysis to see if there are the kinds of plants that would support honeybees in the environment. That still wouldn't give you the honey, but it would give you a proxy. Um, I don't know what the specific test for honey would
Yeah.
be, but it would probably be in relatively small quantities. We don't really have anything like an ancient apothecary. We've not found that archaeologically. Like you could imagine finding a household that has lots and lots of little pots of different things, and then you could do residue analysis to see what's in those little pots. But as far as I know, no one has actually traced honey in any kind of ancient vessel, although maybe it's because we haven't quite looked. So thanks for the question.
Right. Okay, I think this has to be our last question, but going back to sort of the archaeological research of the archaeological work, what are you seeing? And the question is talking about changes in cuisine that is based on changes in climate or environmental changes. And if you can track that or see that over time, different foods used at different times because they just grew better in those conditions. You have what can you say about changing diets, changing crops, and changing climates?
So about 5,000 years ago, 4,000 years ago, the primary place of urban development and very tightly interconnected communities was in the Indus region of what is now Pakistan, and then the western part of India. The Harappan culture, sometimes also called Indus culture, Indus Valley culture, was heavily focused on wheat, as well as domesticated animals like sheep and goats. And rice was really not part of the Indus culture. And it's very interesting that the development of the Gangetic cultures starts right about the time when rice is also becoming much more prevalent. There's some tracing and crossing in rice varieties from all over the Indian subcontinent. Also seems like some rice varieties are coming through Central Asia from China. It's a very complicated field of genetic study about genetic crossing in rice. But it's interesting that rice agriculture and urbanism and Buddhism and landscape management caused this big draw and a shift to the Gangetic Plain and other parts of the Indian subcontinent right at the time when the Indus culture seems to be in decline. So those cities are no longer occupied, and you seem to have this shift of population. And it's probably something that has a multi-causal background, but there has been a suggestion that some environmental shifts happened that made that Indus area less attractive and the Ganges area more attractive, along with the package of rice that can produce, lots of food for lots of people. Then you had this sort of renewal of urbanism some hundreds of years later, once rice agriculture really became accentuated. And if you think about the map of global monsoons, rice, and population, you can see that that ability to support large populations also is coincident with China, Southeast Asia, and the Indian subcontinent today.
Yeah. All right. I think I'm going to turn it back over to Rebecca. Thank you, Monica.
Thank you. This has been delightful.
This has just been terrific. And thanks, Ben. I saw the questions. They were really incredible. And it's got me thinking about how I can find out more information. I know that Monica had posted at the very last slide of her talk some reading, and somebody suggested a book called All the Tea in China, How England Stole the World's Favorite Drink and Changed History. I've actually read it. It was quite interesting. That was by Sarah Rose. So thank you again to Dr. Monica Smith. That was absolutely wonderful. And as always, if you'd like to support the AIA and the Archaeology Abridged program, you can either text GIVE, that's GIV, to 833-965-2840, or you can visit our donate page on our website, which is archaeological.org/donate. And we look forward to seeing you at future talks. And we'll be sending out the link of this recording today. It should be posted later today. We'll probably send out the link tomorrow. So please check it out so you can go back and get some of the information that you may have missed. Thanks again, Monica, and have a great day, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.